and welcome to Chat with Dr. Kat. I'm Dr. Kat. It is great to see all of you today. Today we're going to be talking about ADHD, attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity, with or without sometimes. It seems to be a diagnosis that sometimes can be misdiagnosed. Maybe in certain circumstances it's overdiagnosed. And sometimes we're just not looking from a natural approach that can kind of come in and step in and take over some of the symptoms that we see in children and adults. Today we're going to be focusing though on children, adolescents, and what's going on with ADHD, diagnosing, what are some of the alternatives that we can look at. And we have this beautiful expert today, Dana Kay. I'm going to read you her bio because I think it's just wonderful. Dana Kay is a trusted expert in the ADHD space, a board-certified health and nutrition practitioner, two-time international best-selling author, and the CEO and founder of the ADHD Thrive Institute. Love that name, Thrive. She's also the host of the Soaring Child podcast and a mom to a child with ADHD, which means her work is grounded in both lived experience and clinical experience. She's been featured in Forbes, Fox, and CBS. So in other words, she knows what she's doing. This is why we have her today. This is fantastic. One thing I just want to point out, the two names that you selected, Thrive and Soaring, clearly from a mom who has been working with a child with ADHD. Her book, look at this book. It's called Thriving with ADHD, A Guide to Naturally Reducing ADHD Symptoms in Your Child. This is the book. I will be speaking about it here and there. Go out, get this book. If you have a child that you think has ADHD, has been diagnosed with ADHD, or maybe you're an educator, fellow therapist, this is a great book to have in your library. Dana, welcome. Nice to have you here.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. That was a great introduction. Thank you.
So let's just start in. What is your experience with ADHD, both in your professional life and also your personal experience?
Yeah, look, believe it or not, I actually used to be completely removed from health and wellness. And honestly, I'd never sort of planned to do this work. And my background was originally in accounting. I always say, don't tell anyone. I'm just telling everyone on the podcast. I know I don't sound American. I do live in sunny Seattle, Washington. I'm originally from Australia. We've been here for over 12 years. But, I worked in accounting and then I became a mum. And everything shifted.
It changes you.
It does. And when my oldest son started really struggling quite severely from a really young age, he was incredibly bright and funny and loving, but also extremely dysregulated. And the meltdowns were intense and we were walking on eggshells all the time. And I remember feeling like every outing could turn into a disaster at any moment. And, unless you sort of lived that as a parent, it's hard to sort of explain the level of stress it creates in the home. Now, eventually we got an ADHD diagnosis, and at first it was actually a relief because I thought, okay, it's not my fault.
And you have a name to it.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not a bad mum, but now we know what this is, and now someone can help us. And, like many families, medication was presented as the main option. I like to say this because I think it's important. I'm not anti-medication at all. We use medication, and at the time I thought it was the right thing to do. But what started happening was that every time we solved one problem, another one appeared. One medication, affected the appetite. Then sleep became an issue. Then anxiety increased. Then another medication was suggested to counteract the side effects from the first medication. Yeah. And I remember this one moment so clearly. The doctor suggested the fourth medication. My son was 5 at the time and he was on 3, and they wanted him on a fourth medication.
Wow.
Not because he needed it for the original problem, but because the medications themselves were creating more issues. And, I had this moment of like, hang on, this doesn't feel right in my gut, and this can't be the entire conversation. So I did what probably most mums would do. I started researching obsessively. It became all consuming: gut health, nutrition, inflammation, all of this sort of stuff. I went back to school, studied, nutritional and functional medicine because I needed answers for my own child. And when we started addressing what was happening inside his body, that's when things started to change. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily. The meltdowns reduced, the emotional regulation improved, the focus improved, our house became calmer. And what hit me the hardest was realizing how many other families are being told this is just ADHD and medication or therapy is the only way that you can handle it, when there may be biological stress that's happening underneath driving it. And it became my mission. Right. My son now is 16. He's driving. I still can't believe it. Game changer for me as a mum, I can tell you that. But he hasn't been on meds for years, and he's doing fabulous. And our house is calm as it can be with two boys. Let's be real. But that became my mission. And fast forward today, we've now supported over 1,600 families inside the ADHD Thrive Institute. I chose Thrive because these kids can thrive. They can soar. And what keeps me doing this work is seeing parents finally understand that their child isn't broken.
Right.
So many of these kids are carrying this enormous amount of stress inside their bodies. And when you reduce that stress and you support the biology properly, incredible things can happen.
Yes. Like I said in the beginning, thrive and soaring. I love those two words. And especially with kids with ADHD, as well as adults that had never been diagnosed with it. Because when we really look at it, and you do the deep dive, some of the most amazing people that are successes in our system and our communities and our world today had been diagnosed with ADHD at a young age, because they usually do tend to be very, very brilliant, amazing individuals, but the normal school setting is not okay for them. And really, look, I can get on another soapbox, and I really think our education system across the nation, and in some cases our world, needs to shift and be more experiential, to sit in a room all day long. I've taught graduate school, and I taught elementary school when I was getting my master's degree. And then after graduate school, which honestly, the same excuses I heard were in both. I literally had somebody come in and say the dog ate my homework.
I was about to actually say, did someone say, did the dog eat your
They did. And I looked and I said, well, I'm sure you had a backup. So that excuse doesn't work. But, even in that setting, I really made it experiential. I wanted it to be where they were living what they were learning, because we can learn that way, as well as bringing in information for those brains who do need to be able to read and write and bring all that stuff in.
Completely agree.
But you talk about, looking at the signals from inside the body. Yeah. I've seen that with many people I've worked with as well. What has your experience been with those signals that you're seeing within the body?
Yeah, look, I think this is probably like the biggest shift in perspective that I try to teach parents, because most people are taught to look at ADHD behaviors sort of in isolation, the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the inability to focus, the emotional explosions. And the assumption is often, this is just ADHD. This is who the child is. This is purely a brain disorder. But when I look at those symptoms, I see them differently, and I see them as signals that the body may be under stress. Now, that stress, in my experience, and working with so many families in my education, can come from many different places. It can come from gut dysfunction, food sensitivities, inflammation, poor detoxification, mold exposure, blood sugar instability. I could go on. And what's fascinating is that many of these stresses create very similar behavioral and brain symptoms. So a child may look ADHD externally to the world, but internally their body is struggling. Now, for example, if a child has chronic inflammation, just like an adult, that inflammation, it's going to affect the brain.
Yes.
If the gut is inflamed, neurotransmitter, like our hormones that balance our mood and our cognitive function, that production can be affected. If nutrient levels are depleted, the brain can't function optimally because that's the gas in the brain. And, it's like
Correct.
a car. When your car doesn't have any gas, it's not going to function well. It's not going to be able to drive. It's not going to be able to focus. If toxins build up faster than the body can clear them out, the nervous system becomes stressed. And, children often can't articulate that something feels off internally. So the body speaks through behavior and symptoms. Right. And that's why I always say behavior is that communication, and I think it's such an empowering perspective for parents because it moves us away from blame,
Yes.
Instead of like my child's being difficult or my child is choosing this or it's just ADHD, what we start asking, what is stressing the child's system? And that question, it changes everything because now we actually stop fighting the child and we start becoming these detectives trying to understand what the body may be struggling with underneath the surface.
All of that, when I look at my own research with ADHD and what I discovered back then and even now, and I bring up this example in different episodes because I want it to hit home with people, with kids with ADHD or anybody struggling with their child. I had this child that came in and parents presented as he has ADHD. We already know. We had a diagnosis. School sees it. We see it. We need help. So usually what I do is I start talking about their diet. What is it that they're eating? How are they sleeping? All sorts of things. And then I ask them to go and get allergy food tested just to see if there's sensitivities or anything else. And sometimes it's a struggle because they're like, just fix my kid. Well, okay. We have to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah,
this one boy,
I love that.
This one boy in particular, when I talked to the teacher, spoke to the parents, absolutely all classic symptoms. But some things were missing a bit. So I said, we need to get food allergy tested. He went in, he had a pretty high allergy to dairy and wheat. Yet it didn't manifest through hives or throwing up or anaphylactic, none of those things. It manifested behaviorally. So every morning he would wake up and have frosted mini wheats. So then you added the bolt of sugar on top of it. Yep. And when he left, went to school, symptoms. He got home. What was his snack of choice? Another bowl of frosted mini wheats. So nothing against frosted mini wheats and their cereal. It's just with this child in particular, this is why we saw symptoms in both locations. Once we started taking away wheat and dairy in this child's life, he was able to adjust. Symptoms dropped. Now, we still had behavioral patterns that were becoming a learned response. We had to work on those to move away because it wasn't magic, just have food allergy, find out it's milk and woo, everything's done. No, you still have to work with the other things. So what are some of the things in your experience and in your institute where you see specific things that exacerbate behavior? What are you seeing?
I love that you are a therapist and you are asking those questions. Like that is what should be the first port of call when a diagnosis of ADHD.
Agreed.
So I absolutely love that. One of the biggest stresses in what I see contributing to ADHD symptoms is inflammation. Mm-hmm. And it's important to start reducing inflammation from the start. And for that child, that inflammation was being created by those food allergies. For other children, it will be different. But chronic inflammation, it's become so much more prevalent over the years. It's linked to so many diseases. Inflammation is obviously essential for our wound healing and our but chronic inflammation, your body's constantly on. It's constantly, trying to break down all of these stresses that are going on. It can wreak havoc on the healthy tissues.
Right.
But there's always a way to reduce the risk of chronic inflammation by making changes or identifying what those specific drivers are for the child. Inflammation is that biological response that's triggered by the immune system. And so whether it is food allergies, food sensitivities, infections, bacteria, parasites, mold exposure, that is going to cause the inflammation system to stay on all the time. So, I think, that's the ugly inflammation. There's obviously the good one, but that's the ugly inflammation. And eventually they cause several diseases and conditions, and they cause behavioral symptoms. And so I think that's, if we take a top level view of what's going on in our children, they're suffering from chronic inflammation, and we need to determine what are the main drivers of that chronic inflammation for that specific child.
It's interesting because I have really talked about this one diet over and over to parents. Now, it's extreme, but it originated from this one theorist, Feingold. And
yes, I know it.
Right? And throughout the years, he was the devil. And then other times he was sent from the heavens above because he changed kids' life. And it is extreme and maybe not always as possible, because, deprivation can be another host of issues that I always talk about. You don't want to have that deprivation, but it's an interesting thing. The struggle becomes, this is one thing I want to see if you see this in your institute as well. I saw it within my own children, but because of my experience and because of my knowledge and my education, I was very strict about what my children ate at the beginning of their life. I didn't introduce sugar into their life until they were 3 years old. The second one was much harder because the first one had at that point, was getting sugar.
Yes.
It was still limited, Our desserts were strawberries and whipped cream. It wasn't a cookie or a candy. And I remember some of the other moms, and here's the question I have, some of the other moms were a bit judgy that I was not doing that. If we started going to birthday parties and cake was served, well, they didn't know what cake was. And kids weren't necessarily at 1 and 2 sitting down at a table to have cake. It was parents having cake and feeding the child cake. Mine, I'd grab a bag of something that was her favorite treat and I'd give it to her. And she didn't know the wiser because she wanted to go back into the jumpy house or the water table or doing whatever it was. And my whole thing became, I don't judge you, you don't judge me. Let's just
100%.
go through with this. But what I wanted to do was establish a system, which again can be affected throughout their life. But in the first part of their life, I wanted their bodies to be able to regulate good food and to develop a palate for good food and things like that. But my other fear was all the crud, especially in the United States, that we have in our foods and the preservatives and the dyes. I remember my kids were early readers and I taught them how to read labels and to be responsible for health. I remember they were so little and they'd go, red dye 40. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's go to the next. And it would become a game of trying to find a snack, without red dye 40 or BHT or some of these other horrible ones. So, sugar can be one of the worst things for a kid with ADHD, and it's sad, but you can see it light up in them, and of course these preservatives and artificial dyes. Do you have that come in where parents and kids are talking about the pressure from their communities, their friend groups, to, kind of, you don't want them to be outside of the loop, but at the same time, I always say sometimes your worst enemy can be a too lenient parent. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, look, a big part of what we do is, diet. What goes in your mouth is what you're going to get out. If you put CRAP in, you're going to get CRAP out. And so, I like to lead with data, and we do a lot of functional lab testing in our business to determine what specifically for that child they're being affected by. Is it gluten, is it dairy? I will say most gluten and dairy in the United States is not good. It's not processed well. It has a lot of those things that you mentioned. And so because we've got experience with working with over 1,600 families, all of those obstacles we help families with every single day. We have 5 group coaching calls every week for those exact things. We teach families how to overcome those obstacles, birthday parties, things like that. But, I think at the end of the day, families have to, I like to say, you got to choose your hard. Do you want to choose the hard in terms of constant meltdowns every single day for the rest of the time your child is at home? Or do you want to choose the hard of making some dietary changes now, so in, say, 3 months' time, the kid's not melting down every day, and your house is starting to get a bit more balanced. Your child is starting to be a bit more happier. So yes, it might be hard right now, but in 3 months' time, you're like, I am never going back to that way of eating.
Right.
And so, all of the things that you mentioned, yes, it's real. But when you see the changes in your child, I've spoken to thousands of families, and they come to me when they've tried everything they've been told.
Right.
And they're in a state of pain, and which I was as well. And I would have done just about everything to help my son, and I did. And that feeling of walking on eggshells in your home every single day, the guilt going to bed at night, the guilt waking up in the morning, dreading what the day is going to feel like. A few dietary changes, yes, while it's hard, it's worth it. And, people will understand that when your kid they see the changes in it. I think the biggest thing is when you're there doing those things in your day-to-day life, you see all of these sudden these little changes start to happen. But when a teacher or another family comes in and hasn't seen your child for a while, they'll be like, what have you done? Oh, we've just changed the diet. But again, I like to lead with data. I like to do functional lab testing, seeing what's exactly exacerbating those symptoms for that child, and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, it's so important because, I traveled with my family and we were overseas and my kids are college level now. And, one at the beginning, one at the end, towards the end. And we traveled and no heartburn. I've never had heartburn, but my husband has heartburn. My younger daughter has heartburn who, struggles with it. And we went there. You're eating pasta every day, gorgeous bread every day, dairy, cheeses, everything else. No issues. No issues.
Because there's no preservatives, there's no chemicals. And, it's like in Australia and in the UK, a lot of these food dyes and flavors, they're not even allowed in the food.
No.
Yes, USA is starting to make some changes recently around dyes in particular, but that's not written into law.
No.
And so it's actually at the end of the day not going to change because companies actually don't have to do it. The big ones will because, it's a PR thing, but the little ones, they don't have to do it. So our kids are getting fed these chemicals and these preservatives, and it's adding to the load. It's adding to that inflammation inflammation in the body, and then continuing to exacerbate those ADHD symptoms.
Absolutely. And I think that, we were in Italy and we went into this candy store. The girls wanted candy and we went in and they had an entire wall of Haribo. Okay. The Haribo, the gummies.
Yes.
And of course, and it had every shape, every flavor, everything possible, from the snakes, the rings, the this. So I walked up and I started looking at them and, they just didn't look as bright as they are in the U.S. And of course, I just started looking at all the bags. Not one with anything artificial in it. The ingredient list was minimal. They were showing what they were being flavored with, the natural fruits and vegetables and everything else. So I went up to the person, and I've said this before at another episode as well, too, because I want this to hit home. And that is, I asked him, I said, how is it that none of this, she says, well, we cannot sell that we cannot. And then she says, do they make it with all that stuff in? And I said, oh yeah, and they ship it to the US because in the US, everything is so bright and so colorful, and the flavors are over the top, because we did buy a couple. Flavors were absolutely different. It was still there. It was still lovely, but it just wasn't. It didn't have that brightness, even in the flavor, which you don't need. Yes.
Yeah, you don't need it. You know the difference? In Europe, in Australia, you have to prove that something is safe for human consumption if it goes into a food product. In the US, it is safe until proven guilty.
Correct.
And so what large food company out there is actually going to put money into proving that a chemical is hurtful? No one is. And so that's the difference. And so, which I think, things are starting to change in the US here, but, it's still a long way to go.
It's still a long way to go. I do see some of these products like I saw Doritos, I think maybe Cheetos, that came out with a natural, which I was like, way to go. The only issue I had is that the bag was not as engaging for a child.
Why?
Right? It was a white. I think it's a white bag, and it's a little colorful, but it's, they need that draw. There's another candy company that I've seen. I want to say it's called Joy or Joy Ride, maybe, that has things like licorice and gummies, no sugar, no high levels of sugar, and it doesn't have any artificial dyes or preservatives. And I was like, way to go. And I'm seeing it at Target. I saw it at Walmart. I've seen it at different places because, I want to be able to tell people that I work with and also within my own family to say, hey, these products do exist. The other thing is, when I got back, and now I know not everyone can do this, and let me tell you, it's a choice. It is a choice to make the time. And, I make my own bread now, own yogurt. I just started last night. I brought out my first batch of sour cream and on his way to making cream cheese. I'm trying to do these things because it's just healthier. And my family then doesn't struggle with that internal stuff that goes on. So I'm glad you really talk a lot about that gut influence because we're seeing more about it, but not a lot of people lead with it. And that's what I really, really liked. Again, everybody, what I really, really liked about when you and I first spoke and what's in your book, it's just practical ways to work with your children. So what are some things that you've seen maybe supplement-wise or things that you could recommend for families with kids with ADHD?
Yeah, look, I will always say that, supplements are an important part of helping a kid naturally with ADHD, but they're not the be all and end all. And I just want to preface this to say, like you mentioned that gut, and I think that's really important for families to understand because the basis of everything that I do at the ADHD Thrive Institute starts with the gut. It is the center of everything. And the gut-brain connection is honestly one of the most important conversations that needs to happen around ADHD. You know, we think of the gut as a digestive organ. But we understand it is deeply connected to the brain. It's 80% of the body's entire immune system is in there. It's connected to our hormones, our detoxification, our nervous system. The gut and brain are constantly communicating, you know, with each other through what we call the gut-brain axis. And one of the biggest sort of aha moments when I learned this back in the day was that around 90% of our body's serotonin and about 50% of our body's dopamine, which is really important with ADHD. These are the hormones that balance our mood, help our cognitive function. These are actually produced in the gut. You know, so a huge amount of this neurotransmitter activity is actually connected to the gut. So when the gut's inflamed or imbalanced, it affects mood, focus, emotional regulation, anxiety, behavior. But the tricky part is kids do not always have obvious digestive symptoms, and that's really important to understand. So a child can have gut dysfunction without stomach aches. Instead, it may show up as meltdowns, anxiety, hyperactivity, eczema, asthma, you know, poor focus. So, you know, it's really important to understand that first. And that's why I spend so much time looking at things like food sensitivities, like gut infections, yeast overgrowth, you know, intestinal permeability, because you can't separate the brain from the body. And for many kids, the brain symptoms are actually the downstream result of the stress that's happening elsewhere, you know, usually in the gut. And so I wanted to just sort of preface that first to say that a big part of all the things that I suggest and we teach families is centered around that gut. And so, you know, a great supplement to start with is a good quality probiotic, not the one that you get at Target. Right. But, you know, a really good probiotic can really start cementing the gut health, but really then diving deep into, okay, well, what is disrupting that gut? Some of those things that I already mentioned, that bacteria, that yeast overgrowth. And so we'll bring in targeted supplementation for those children. That's the issue. Every child is a bio-individual. And that means that one supplement that might work for one child might not necessarily work for another child. There are some real good base ones that everyone can start with. Good quality probiotic, magnesium supplement. You know, there are a lot of studies around that kids with ADHD have lower levels of magnesium, so it can be super beneficial for calming, for sleep, for anxiety, things like that. Omega-3 fatty acids, again, probably one of the most studied nutritional supplement out there for ADHD. And so that can really be a game changer in reducing hyperactivity and really helping a child thrive. Vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin. And so many kids are deficient in vitamin D as well. So these are some of those base ones, but I want families to realize, like, you can't supplement your way out of a body that's riddled with inflammation. You can't supplement your way out of a poor diet. You can't supplement your way out of things. And so, yes, it is such a critical piece of the puzzle, but there are some other elements that need to come in. We've discussed some of those around food. As I said, functional lab testing is a big one to determine what that child needs.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you say functional lab testing, what is that, and how do parents ask for that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Look, I like to look at functional. So we've got traditional lab testing. You go to the doctor, they do some labs, and most likely things will come back in normal ranges. And so traditional lab testing is really there to diagnose disease. It's really there to diagnose something, to go, do they have a disease present? Whereas functional lab testing is really looking beneath the surface at how the body is functioning on a day-to-day basis, and not necessarily a diagnosable disease. And so we do a number of these functional lab testing for families all across the USA. Mm-hmm. We just send the kits to their house. They send back the samples, and then we develop a bio-individual plan for that particular child. And we do that through urine. We do that through finger prick, sometimes stool. It really depends on the child. So we're really looking deeper at what is going on inside that particular child's body. Now, you go to a traditional pediatrician, they usually won't be able to order these labs. Most of them are not trained in gut health. Most of them are not trained in nutrition, and that's okay. You know, as I said, medication has its place. I'm not against it. Traditional medicine is there really to help you when you're suffering really badly. But most of our kids, we're going to be labeled with, okay, well, it's just ADHD.
Right.
Here's the diagnostic code. Here is the medication that goes along with that. That's how the medical industry works here. So, you know, insurance will cover what they will cover with that code and then prescribe a medication. So we look at it differently. We look at the gut health. Mm-hmm. We look at, is there inflammation? We look at what foods is that body reacting to? Like you mentioned, that allergy that child had. Are there food sensitivities, which is different to allergies? Mm-hmm. And so it really looks at what's happening on a day-to-day basis, not whether a disease is present. It's kind of like this little sort of, I always forget the name. Perimenopause. Oh my gosh. Okay. My brain just turns off. Investigator, what's the name of that? They hold the little
the microscope. Or no, it's the magnifying glass.
A magnifying glass. It's like this little magnifying glass into the body. That is terrible. I'm so sorry. Yes. While I specialize kids with ADHD, I don't specialize in female perimenopause hormones, but I do need to work with someone because
some of it's very similar, which is hysterical, but it's very similar.
Yeah. So it is very similar. At the end of the day, if you're suffering from fibromyalgia, if you're suffering from, inflammation in your hip, if you're suffering from, type 2 diabetes, whatever it is, a lot of what I teach will help that as well.
Yes. And you know what I think is important too is that, you mentioned it at the beginning that, sometimes we, as parents, you lay in bed and you're feeling the guilt. You're trying to process what went on during the day. Yeah. You're hurt because when you have a child that is lacking impulse control, they say mean, horrible things and they're lashing out and you take that in and you want to take a step back. And it is important sometimes for parents it is okay to take a step back. It is okay to tell your child, hey, you hurt me. This is not okay. You can't disrespect me and then expect me to keep caring in the same way. I'm still going to love you, but at the same time, there needs to be a knowledge that what they do is not okay.
Yep.
And because if not, then what happens is we're training the, sorry, the same thing over and over and over again, which again, as human beings, we are creatures of habit. But
I love what you said earlier in that, for me, when a child says those things, their body's on fire underneath. Yes. They don't mean them. Then it's just coming out. But it does become a learnt behavior. So when we can start reducing that inflammation in the body and those symptoms will naturally get better, we need to support that with relearning the behavior. But also, it's like the house. It adapts to ADHD. It adapts to the symptoms.
Correct.
It's in that fight or flight. So we actually need to retrain the family dynamics and, what's going on in there as well. And so I love that you said that earlier because I think that that's really important to understand.
It is important. And I think, the other thing is too, is that when we're dealing with children with ADHD and symptomology and all the things that go on while they are, oh, hello, hi. Oh,
I'm sorry. That was Oliver. That was my boy that got me into it. It's 11:52 here in Seattle. School is still in, but being in high school, grade 10, they've got their finals this week, and so they finished early. So of course he can drive. He drove himself home from school.
I love it. I love it. I know we have 2 fuzzy babies as well. So when I see them too, I was like, oh, how cute.
Yeah.
So, but here's the thing that I was saying is that, just when you have a child with ADHD, just when you see things that are regulated and things are becoming better, you have far and few between outbursts. They seem to be eating right. Everything's great. Well, their body's changing. I mean, this is the time in their life where you have this rapid growth, right? So now you've gone through elementary school and things, okay, you're regulating. Then they get to middle school. Now there's a other host, and then you have to re-regulate. Then they get to high school. It's a whole other slew because, everybody's having the Starbucks, the sugary drinks, all the different things that are going on. I think marijuana is a huge impact when you see with kids, any kid, but, especially with the ADHD brain, it's one of the worst things that you can do. But they're exposed to all of these things. So here's my question. What do you do? How do you help families with kids with ADHD that start to spiral when they're older and they'll take some things sometimes, they'll work with things sometimes, behavior is out of control at times, you try to regulate, you're working with gut health, you're trying to, but nothing is stable. And then they get to college and they move away. And now they're grabbing the Taco Bell as opposed to having mom and dad's food at home. So what do you do there?
Yeah, look, it's the same process. I think when they get older, and, I work with families up until the age of 21, we want to make sure they're obviously on board if we're going down this process with them. But, again, I like to use data. Mm-hmm. So if you can show them on a lab, like, look at what is going on in your body right now. Mm-hmm. Your body's crying out for help. Mm-hmm. And so let's commit to this. They know they're struggling. And so I'm sure they don't want to struggle anymore. And so I think that, present them with the data and say, look, we can help you. Mm-hmm. But when they get to that age, it's like it's got to start becoming their responsibility. Correct. And, you're not going to be able to lead a horse to water and, and make them drink. You can lead them there, but you can't make them drink. And so, when they're 18, when they're 20, when they're going off to college, they need to really own the process. But I like to present them with the data. That's why we start with functional lab testing. Right. It's like, well, it's here on the paper. We can help you.
Right.
Do you want that help? Do you want to feel better? Do you want to be able to focus? Do you want to be able to feel more regulated in your mood? Because usually they are struggling and they don't want to struggle.
No, they don't want to struggle. But teenagers, the problem is, especially right now, I mentioned this in a few other episodes of the podcast, is that a lot of the kids are getting influenced by TikTok, and right now the flavor is to vilify the parent because of a few select situations where maybe parents didn't use their best judgment. We're all human. We said the wrong things. We did the wrong things. But in comparison to all the amazing things that are being done, that doesn't matter because it's been focused on a couple of different things. So with teenagers, I think it's just continuing to show support, set boundaries where you can, and educate. I agree. There's so many different reels and TikToks that you can send to your child that they're hearing another voice, but it's very real. I say to a lot of parents that I work with, especially about weed, where it's somebody who had smoked weed for 5 years. They're young and they say, I didn't realize what I was doing. And let me show you after I've been off for 2 months how my life has changed. Those are impactful because they're relating to the child. So sometimes if you can't have that direct communication, yet we want them to be off of screen time, but you have to go where they're at too.
And so you have to meet them
right?
where they're at for sure. The funny thing in that you say that you're sending your kids all these TikTok. Yes, keep sending them. I've now actually started screenshotting the TikTok rather than sending the link because my 16-year-old has told me like, I never watch anything that you send me. So actually like funny that yesterday I sent him 2 different images of what actually was in TikTok. And so he can't unsee what I sent him.
Right.
But when you actually send a reel or whatever, he's like, I'm not going to watch what you send through.
It's so funny. There's an actual reel of this. I saw this one of this woman sitting on her bed and she's laughing hysterically. And it says, sending my kid another reel that I find hysterical that they'll never watch. And it's so true. Absolutely. Do the screenshots, do all those things, connect with them, in the best way that you can. I know you have a theory that you talked about with the trash can. So I wanted to touch on that because I think it's a great one. Can you tell us about your theory, your thoughts around the trash can?
Yeah, look, it is my favorite analogy that I use for all of my sorry.
Oh, yeah, just let her in. Let the pup in.
I'm sorry. He was scratching at the door.
Oh, it's a boy.
I was like, oh my God. There's this powerful analogy I use, and it's really an important way to explain what's going on with our children with ADHD. We've all got this, and I'll show you, we've all got this metaphorical trash can in our body. That's great. And the goal through life is to keep the load on the trash can low, just like a normal trash can, our body tries to empty the trash can. We put the trash can on the side of the road on a Monday so the garbage truck can pick it up. Throughout life, things get thrown in the trash can. It could be poor diet. It could be viruses. It could be bacteria. It could be medication, environmental toxins, preservatives, heavy metals, mold exposure, all the things that I've mentioned. All of that adds to the load on the trash can. Now, as I mentioned, normally the body is meant to empty it, and that's done through our detoxification pathways. And so that's what healthy detoxification looks like. We put it out on the curb on a Monday. The liver processes the toxins, the gut removes the waste, the kidneys, filter it all out, the body clears everything out. But what I found with so many kids with ADHD is that their bodies are not emptying the trash can efficiently. Mm-hmm. And that can be for many reasons. A big one I see is genetics. We do a lot of DNA testing inside the business. It could also be gut dysfunction. It could be high toxic exposure, methylation issues, all of these different things. So now the trash starts piling up faster than the body can clear it. Mm-hmm. Eventually it overflows. That overflows creates inflammation, stress throughout the body, stress in the brain. This will show up as mood swings, emotional dysregulation, focus issues. When you think about your house, if you don't take the trash out ever, it's going to be stinky. It's going to be awful. Like you're going to be like, oh, I can't even live. If that's happening in your body, you're not going to be able to focus. You're not going to feel good. You're not going to be able to sleep properly. You are going to have sensory issues. And so, I'm not saying ADHD is caused by toxins or one single thing. The analogy is about that cumulative load because every child's trash can is different. One child is affected by mold. One's affected by food allergies. And the more overloaded the system becomes, the harder it is for the brain and the nervous system to function well, And so I think it's, one of the most powerful analogies. The goal becomes reduce the load going in, improve the body's ability to take the trash out. And this is where we can start to see huge changes with our kiddos.
That's so great. I love that because it's true. If you don't take the trash out, it gets overwhelming. And I think the other thing to even attached to that is that sometimes you see kids with ADHD with horrific, messy rooms. And they're dysregulated. It's hard for them. It's depressing. It's anxious. It's all of those things. Yet they cannot figure out how to do it. It's almost like, we see those hoarder shows. And if you look at a hoarder, which is an entirely separate issue, but if you look at those hoarders, a lot of times it is that attachment to what's there, but it's also the inability to see a project in its entirety that's not overwhelming. So sometimes it's just clean off 2 things off of that one chair, or maybe just clear off that one counter of 2 inches. Just let's do 2 to 5 inches as opposed to looking at the mass room. It's difficult with adolescents because they don't want to be told and everything else. But with younger children, I think it is important to say, this is what I need you to do, because it regulates better. And beautifully using your trash analogy is that you don't want it to get so overwhelming that then it affects absolutely everything. How your room looks, how does your environment look, what does it smell like, all of those different things of overload. So,
and when you think about it, like if the body's already internally overloaded, everything externally is going to feel overloaded as well. So let's reduce the internal load so the external load doesn't feel as big and over, just too much.
So let's switch a little bit. We haven't really spoken about medication. What do you, some medication, in my experience, some of the kids that I work with, some medications work for some kids. You may be able to work with somebody takes Vyvanse or somebody else takes Adderall. One doesn't work with the other. And you said something at the beginning that really hit home as well with me, is that I work with psychiatrists that are not, and more power to all the psychiatrists out there. I get it. But what I prefer to refer in my practice is somebody who is not like, and here's another medication, and here's another medication. Part of my interview process when I have a group of psychiatrists that I can refer to is I make it very clear. I let them know I am not looking for somebody who already has their pad ready to write the prescription. I want it to be that sometimes a kid is going to walk away that you don't feel they need a prescription, that there's still things that they can do with their gut, with eating, and all these other things that they can do first. And then if the kid has to go on medication because all other things have been worked on, that they don't go to the second, the third, and the fourth medication to regulate other things as well. So I really like that you spoke about that, because sometimes it's a rabbit hole. And it's true with mental health on the other side. With my depression and anxiety, people that I work with, they'll come in and they're on their 4th medication, and it's like, okay.
I know. And you think about that, like with a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. I love that you try to find a network of psychiatrists that will lead with what else first. And I think that's so important. I think it's such an important conversation, because, I try to sort of approach this conversation with, nuance and compassion. And I say, like, as I said clearly at the beginning, there are absolutely children where medication can be helpful. I'm not anti-medication. But for some families, medication, it can create enough stability for the child to function better for that moment, or even for the deeper healing work that we do,
right,
to become possible. And what I've seen over and over again is that medications often work very, very differently depending on the state of the child's underlying biology. And this is the piece I think that gets missed, because, ADHD medications are primarily acting on, the neurotransmitters dopamine and norepinephrine. But what if the body underneath is already under a huge amount of stress? What if the child has gut inflammation, like what you were saying, or nutrient deficiencies? Now you're essentially putting more pressure onto an already overwhelmed system. And for some kids, that's when the symptoms will get even worse. And just like my son, that first medication, because his body was already overloaded, started to create these terrible side effects. Then they had to put on more medication. Then it created more side effects. And so, I kind of explain it, if your child's nervous system is already running on fumes, medication can sometimes feel like pushing harder on the accelerator when the engine itself is struggling underneath the hood. Sometimes the medication itself is not the real issue. Sometimes the body underneath simply does not have sort of the resilience to tolerate it well. Now, nutrient status also plays a huge role. Like things like zinc, magnesium, iron, omega-3s, B vitamins are all involved in neurotransmitter production and nervous system regulation. So if a child's already depleted, their brain and body may not respond well. Also, there's detoxification and methylation, okay? And this is where you see some kids do well on Ritalin, some do well on dexmethylphenidate. There is actually a test out there. You can look at some of those basic genes that will tell you which medication they'll respond better to. But some children struggle to process and clear medications efficiently, especially if their detox pathways are already under pressure from everything that we've talked about. So one child may tolerate it relatively well, while another one becomes highly reactive to the exact same medication. And so this is why I think we need to have a bigger conversation around individualized biology. So instead of asking, does this child have ADHD? We should be asking, what stresses is this child's body carrying right now? Because medication may temporarily manage those symptoms, but if we never address the underlying stress load on that system, some children will just continue to struggle underneath. And honestly, that was exactly what happened with my son.
Well, because the other thing is that the medication works for that day. This is not a medication that builds. If you're taking an antidepressant, it can take up to 2 weeks, 3 weeks to ramp up in order to start working. You've got some medications that are instant workers with, you've got Xanax, which can be so abused because it's fast acting. It will work for you the moment within a half an hour of you taking it, you have relief. Well, that's how ADHD medication works. It provides them what they need in order to focus and to reduce hyperactivity until
that period
until 4 o'clock. So maybe they take it in the morning, they come home, and now it's 4 o'clock, and boom, I always call it the medication crash, because they come home and they're exhausted from the day because the brain has been working at a more optimal level and it's exhausting. So then they get home and they crash and they want to go to sleep for 2 hours.
Or the other side, which is what happened with my son, is like the medication just muted him so much and it kept everything inside for that period of time. And he came home and all of a sudden exploded out of him. And he would have the biggest meltdown every single day at the same time in the afternoon.
Because the medication stops working. And so sometimes what I've seen is that some people will do the double medication. They'll do once the kid gets home, then they re-up again. And so now the child is always on medication. Now, for some families that may work for them, but it's true. I always say to people that come in to work with me that I don't have a magic wand, because if I had a magic wand, the line out my door would be blocks and blocks and cities long, because there is nothing magical. Even when you have depression and anxiety, obsessive compulsive, which a lot of times goes with ADHD, but that we didn't talk about today, but that you still have to, the medication will help alleviate those symptoms, but you still have the behavioral patterns that have been developed as a result of doing that. It's like you are limping on a foot, okay? And it starts affecting all these other parts of your body. And now you have issues, here in the elbow or in the knee, and then you have an issue in the pelvis area. And then you heal, And it feels great, but you still have this issue with walking a certain way. You have to learn how to re-walk with the new heel. And so it's the same thing with our brain. You have to be able to start learning these behavioral techniques to kind of change those behavior that were developed. So, you know, I always look at it this way, and this is what I tell parents. You know, if you choose to go down the medication path after you've exhausted some of these other things, because ADHD can be exhausting when you have a child like that. It's exhausting. You feel defeated. You feel sad. And especially when things have been going so great for, say, 2-3 months, and then boom, you're hit with it. And now you're just feel, defeated. So look, the kid has the symptoms, the parents have the symptoms as a result of the symptoms of the child. It's the same thing with anything that goes on. There is hope. There's all of those different things. There's one other thing I want to mention, is another thing that I do when we've exhausted things like, looking at the gut health, looking at what they could have allergies or food or diet changes, things like that. But also get your child, a young child, okay, a young child especially, check to see if they have any vision issues.
Yeah, that's it. I agree. I've seen that a number of times because that can present. Also, another one is sleep apnea.
Absolutely.
If they are breathing with their mouth open when they either during the day or when they're sleeping, definitely get that checked out, because a tired brain looks like an ADHD brain.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, when you have kids that are on medication, they get home, they have the emotional breakdown, they have the sleep, they crash, all of those things. And when they sleep during the day, then they're not sleeping at night. When they're not sleeping at night, then the whole cycle starts again. It becomes this rabbit hole. So you have to be working on everything together. And vision tests, again, especially with young children, I've seen this where, teachers will say, wow, they're not writing on a straight line. Where they're learning their letters and it's all over the page. Well, maybe they're colorblind and they can't see the line, yet the teacher is feeling like there's something pretty drastic going on. Instead of, using a black Sharpie, making some copies, now the kid can see the line. Boop, problem's gone. So, we have to be able, like you said, get your magnifying glass, become the detective, figure out what's going on, see what works, what doesn't work. You talked about supplements. You've talked about a lot of different things. And we've talked about, when there's problems and, parents are stuck and they're feeling like there's no movement, especially I think with adolescents. What would be some of the things that you recommend if you feel like parents are feeling stuck?
Look, I having a child with neurodiversity is tiring, and it's emotionally draining. And, I would say that firstly, look after yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to come first. But I'll also say, follow people that have been through this journey and have come out the other end, and that are looking at it differently. Because if the things that you're being told to do to help that child aren't working, there is something out there that can help. And I had trusted the system. I had followed all the advice that was given. And I remember a day where I went to my pediatrician before I'd, gone back to school, but where I was researching, and I said, what about gut health? What about food sensitivities? He looked at me straight in the eyes and he said, don't bother. None of that works.
Oh.
Now, my 16-year-old boy has not been on meds for years. He's thriving. He is a competitive track athlete. He is doing so well at school. Mm-hmm. None of that matters.
Right.
He's happy.
Right.
So, you are the parent. You know best. You know your child best. And when that body is screaming out at you with these symptoms, something's driving that. Right. And let's get to the bottom of what's driving that. I will also say Rome wasn't built in a day.
Correct.
Because I once I started learning this, I was like diving straight in, and I did a food panel on my son, and I removed out 40 food sensitivities, gluten, dairy, and soy on day one. Mm-hmm. Let's just say I was in my bedroom, multiple panic attacks. What am I going to feed my family? And right. I don't like to. I'm really open and honest about it. I'm not a gourmet chef. I don't do cooking. I do cook, but I just don't like it. It's not one of my favorite things. And that's not how I teach things. Let's take small, slow steps to help you have this become your new normal. Mm-hmm. And so, there's hope out there. A child with ADHD does not need to suffer. No. A child that has ADHD, the family doesn't need to suffer. And so if you feel in your gut that something deeper is going on, trust that.
And, here's some other things, too. I think that, you're going to have, especially when your child is home, you're going to have episodes, you're going to have times where you feel absolutely overwhelmed. Yeah. Hopefully you have a wonderful partner at home. If you don't have maybe your best friend, vent like nobody's business. Vent, get it out, and then you're going to have to get back to work, because the children, because they're growing at such a rapid rate, you're going to have a lot of things that happen that you're not expecting. And again, because things are so great. The other thing is I did start to mention about OCD, and I wanted to touch on that before we finished, is that OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, can be a feature of ADHD, but it doesn't necessarily manifest with opening and closing the door 20 different times. But maybe it's how they say goodnight before they go to sleep, because the anxiety is if they don't say it, then something bad's going to happen. So they develop a compulsion to do it, but it's really to quiet the mind. So you don't want to move away from those things. When they're little, it could be, I need you to open the door for me. I need you to be able to do this for me. And there's things that you want to say, wait, hey, you've got to be independent. Okay, let them find other ways to be independent and slowly move away from these things. Don't kind of make it a point to fix those little things, because that can actually go in a different direction. But again, there's so many different, like, as you mentioned, there's supplements, there's different things. You rattled off several of them, which is great. Magnesium, agree. Magnesium in the morning, there's, different types. Magnesium is not a one size fits all. There's taurate, glycinate. I always say this one wrong. L-threonate, which I absolutely, 3 and 8, that I absolutely, I have that also for my mother who's older. I have her on magnesium, taurate, L-threonate, and then also glycinate in the evening, because there's a depletion there. Absolutely. Omega-3s, saffron, holy basil. There's so many different things. Vitamin D. Absolutely. Those are a lot of things that we can take away with today. You are fabulous, by the way, Dana.
So are you. And I've absolutely loved this conversation. I think that we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours.
Absolutely. I mean, this was great. I think in the future, I'm going to have you come back for another episode, because it is such it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one because, it manifests behaviorally, right? Yeah. So to everyone out there, we see these behavioral symptoms and we want to look at it as they're naughty, and then they're mean, and then they're nasty. And they can be. And a lot of it is coming from this, and it's coming from this that led to behavioral patterns. Take those moments, just like Dana was saying, where you have to help yourself. I love that she says you cannot pour from an empty glass. You have to be able to refill. I think that is so important, whether it's speaking to your partner at home, whether it's reaching out to a best friend, reaching out to an expert. We will have that on the chatwithdrkat.com website, where you can get in touch with Dana. We'll have access to her book as well, which, let me tell you, if you have a child with ADHD, again, or work with children, which anyone who works with children, especially educators, this is great. You're not there to cure, but if there's something you can do just a little bit different to interact with that child, you will change their educational experience rather than shaming them for their horrible behavior, because their behavior will be horrible. No, okay, we can agree on that. But if there's something you could do slightly different, let's do it, because it can change their path. And why not be that one person in that child's life who creates a different pattern, a different feeling in that child? You will see a child thrive and soar when they are seen differently. So please reach out, get that book. Dana, look, you're amazing. We will have a link to your institute as well. So if anyone would like to discuss with me anything about ADHD, if you have a child with ADHD, you yourself have ADHD, reach out. I would love to talk to you about it. It's an important topic, very important topic, and can be easily solved. And what I mean by easily, there's a lot of options now. We have a lot of options other than just the medication. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Dana, for being with us today. You are wonderful. And thank you for also sharing your personal story that has such an impact when people hear. So thank you, everybody out there. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.